The hall smelled like 100 different worlds. Every species brought something with it: gases, oils, chemical signals that passed as emotion in certain atmospheres. The great chamber of the Galactic Council was built, wide enough to hold all of it, wide enough and old enough that the walls had absorbed, for centuries of argument, war prevention, and political theater. Delegate Nora Hale found her seat near the back left of the human section. She sat down her water. She opened her notes. She waited. Around her, the hall filled with noise. Ambassador Drac of the Vorkai arrived with 6 attendants and a personal sound system that played low ceremonial tones wherever he walked. He was 8 feet tall, covered in ridged gray armor skin, and he laughed loudly at something his aides said as he passed the human section without a glance. Usul of the Seath drifted in next, 6 of his 12 limbs folded in the formal resting position. He noticed Nora and gave the small head tilt that, in Seath culture, meant something close to acknowledging furniture. Nora smiled back. She always smiled back. The summit was the 400 cycle gathering. Every major species in the known galaxy sent representatives. Disputes were aired. Alliances were reviewed. Borders were argued over with words instead of weapons. Most of the time, humans had attended every single one of these summits since joining the Council 61 years ago. They had never won a vote by force of argument. They had never threatened anyone. They had never walked out. They just came, every time, and sat, and listened. In the observation tier above the main floor, a junior analyst from the Noon Collective watched the chamber fill. Her name was Brielle, and her job was to document behavioral patterns for the Collective's long-term diplomatic files. She was good at noticing small things. It was why she had been assigned here. She was looking at the attendance records when she found the first odd thing. Humans. 61 years of summits. Not one absence. Not one walkout. Not one formal protest registered through the Council's dispute mechanism. Every other species had walked out at least once. The Vorkai had done it 11 times. Even the Peaceful Noon Collective had sent a formal absence notice during the grain rights crisis of cycle 388. Humans just showed up. Every time. She filed a small note in her records. Probably cultural. Possibly just stubbornness. She moved on. Below, the session opened. The border dispute between the Vorkai and the Seath had been building for 3 cycles. A ribbon of space between their territories held 6 inhabited moons. The Seath had settled them first. The Vorkai had a trade route running through them. Neither side wanted to give ground. 3 million Seath civilians lived on those moons, and the Vorkai fleet had recently moved 2 patrol groups closer than comfort allowed. Every species was asked for its position. The Vorkai wanted freedom of movement. The Seath wanted guaranteed civilian protection zones. The Noon Collective proposed a shared transit corridor. The gas dwellers of the Noon Fringe supported Seath rights. The Keth Union sided with Vorkai trade interests. Species after species registered a position, a counterposition, a nuanced middle stance, or a formal concern. Then the moderator reached the human section. Delegate Hale. Earth's position on the Theris border dispute. Nora looked up from her notes. She paused for exactly 4 seconds. Not long enough to be rude. Not short enough to seem like she had already decided. We abstain, she said. Her voice was calm. Ordinary. Usul made a sound that functioned as laughter in Seath. Drac leaned over to his aide and said something that the translation matrix did not bother to process, because the dismissive tone required no translation. The moderator moved on. Nora wrote something in her notes and picked up her water. Brielle watched from above. She had recorded the abstention. She had recorded the for second pause. She almost moved on. Then she noticed Nora's hands. During the entire session, 3 hours of argument, counter-argument, and formal position stating, Nora Hale's hands did not move. They rested flat on the table. No fidgeting. No gestures. No micro-adjustments. Just still. The way something is. Still when it has decided to be still on purpose. Brielle noted that too. When the recess was called, Nora stood, gathered her notes, and walked to the side corridor with the same unhurried pace she had arrived with. Drac swept past her with his entourage, still laughing about something. She moved out of his way without acknowledgement and continued walking. That night, at the station's 22nd hour mark, Brielle was reviewing the day's sensor logs when a small flag appeared in the automated system. A subharmonic pulse had been detected near the human delegation's private chamber. Duration, 0.3 seconds. Frequency, unusual, but low level. Cause, unidentified. It was the kind of thing that got marked as equipment noise and cleared from the active log by morning. Brielle did not clear it. She sat for a long time looking at the 0.3-second line on her sensor readout. It was nothing, probably. A vibration in the hull. A thermal shift. The station was old and made strange sounds. She saved the file under a new folder she labeled simply Humans. Then she went back through the archive to see if it had happened before. It had. Many times. She kept reading. 3 weeks after the summit, the research vessel Noon Clarity sat in slow orbit above a dead moon, running long-range observation work that required nothing of its crew. Except patience. Brielle had plenty of that. She had spent most of those 3 weeks in the archive. The subharmonic pulses were not new. That was the first thing that unsettled her. The earliest one she could find in the station's sensor history was logged 43 years ago. Same duration range. Same low-frequency band. Same source location, the human delegation quarters, or in earlier records, whatever room the human delegates had been assigned to at that time. 43 years. And no one had ever followed up on it. She brought the file to Elder Counselor Voss on a Tuesday. He looked at it for about 12 seconds. Equipment resonance, he said. The human quarters are near the thermal exchange. Grid on that deck. Expansion and contraction. It's been logged before. The pulses don't match the thermal cycle schedule, Brielle said. Then it's something else. Something minor. He handed the file back. You are a behavioral analyst, Brielle, not a signals engineer. Stay in your lane. She went back to her desk and stayed in her lane. But she kept the file open. That same week, the border dispute reached its worst point. The Vorkai moved a third patrol group into the contested region. Seath civilian transports were being stopped and searched. The council called 3 emergency sessions in 5 days. Every species was loudly positioned. The Noon Collective ran 12 separate diplomatic backchannels. The Keth Union threatened to withdraw trade licenses. 2 minor species issued formal declarations of concern, which meant very little but filled the broadcast channels with noise. Humans attended every session. Nora Hale sat in her seat, drank her water, listened. When Drac, visibly frustrated during the second emergency session, pointed across the chamber and said, "And what does Earth say?" Still nothing as always. Nora had looked up from her notes with that same unhurried expression and said, "We are still listening, Ambassador." The chamber had moved on. Drac had exhaled loudly. Someone from the Keth section made a low comment that the translator rendered as the equivalent of useless. Brielle, watching from the gallery, wrote it all down. Then she did something outside her assigned work. She pulled the timestamp of every recorded subharmonic pulse she had found. 43 years of them, irregular, spread across hundreds of sessions, unpredictable in their spacing. She had already checked them against major galactic events. Wars, treaties, elections, natural disasters. Nothing matched. So she tried something different. She pulled the council's official speech records. Every formal statement made in chamber, logged by speaker and timestamp for the last 43 years. She wrote a script to map moments of human speech against moments of silence, specifically, sessions where a human delegate was present but did not speak at all. She ran the comparison. Her screen filled with correlation markers. Every single subharmonic pulse corresponded to a session where a human delegate had been present and had chosen not to speak. Not sessions where they had spoken, sessions where they had stayed quiet. Brielle sat back in her chair. The silence itself was producing the pulses. Or something about the silence was. The 2 events, human quiet in the chamber, pulse from the human quarters, were not coincidence. The statistical probability of random alignment at this frequency across 43 years was so small her software declined to display it as a percentage and instead printed the word negligible. She did not fully understand what she was looking at. She was a behavioral analyst, not a physicist. She could not explain the mechanism, but she understood correlation. She understood pattern. And what she was looking at was not equipment noise. Something was happening when humans chose not to speak. Something with a physical signature. Something that had been logged and dismissed and re-logged and re-dismissed. For over 4 decades, because nobody thought to ask the right question. She opened a new file. She labeled it Priority Review Request, Human Delegation, Behavioral Archive. She started writing. Before she could finish, an alert came through the General Council feed. The Vorkai had crossed the border. One warship, moving slowly, technically within legal ambiguity, but inside the civilian protection buffer that the Sith had spent 3 sessions arguing. 4. The feed exploded. Emergency protocols were being invoked. Voices on 6 channels spoke over each other. Species positions shifted in real time. The Keth Union changed its stance within 4 minutes. The Noon Fringe called for immediate sanctions. Briel watched the feed with one eye and kept writing with the other. Then a second alert appeared. Smaller. Routine, almost. Delegate Nora Hale had submitted a formal request to address the council floor. It was the first time she had requested the floor in 6 weeks. The chamber, according to the environmental sensors Briel had learned to read as mood indicators, went measurably quieter the moment the request appeared on the moderator's screen. Briel stopped writing. She pulled up the live chamber feed and waited. The moderator granted the floor. No one laughed. No one looked at their notes. No side conversations ran. The chamber, which had been noise and motion and barely contained panic for 3 days straight, went the kind of quiet that a room only goes when something has shifted in it that cannot be named yet. Nora Hale stood. She did not move to the speaker's podium. She spoke from her seat, which was technically irregular, and the moderator did not correct her. Her hands were flat on the table. Her voice was the same voice she always used, even, unhurried, easy to hear without being loud. She spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She did not threaten anyone. She did not raise her voice. She did not cite human military capability, which was modest, or human population figures, which were unremarkable by galactic scale, or Earth's economic weight, which had never moved a vote in 61 years. She talked about decisions. She named the specific moment, the session number, the cycle, the exact phrasing used when Ambassador Drax's predecessor had proposed the original transit corridor framework that the Vorkai had now violated. She named the 3 species that had endorsed it. She named the 2 that had abstained. She named the session where Ussel's delegation had pushed for the civilian protection buffer to be written as advisory rather than binding, and the exact words Ussel had used to argue for that change, and how that one word, advisory, was the legal door the Vorkai ship had just walked through. She named the species that had voted for that language change. She named the ones who had voted against it. She named the ones who had said nothing. She listed 7 more moments. 7 decisions, large and small, across 20 years of council history. She named them all with the same flat, factual tone someone uses when reading coordinates. No accusation in her voice. No anger. Just information. Then she said, every path to this moment was chosen. We have watched each choice be made. We have recorded them. We have said very little, because we believe this council's process was worth trusting. She paused for 2 seconds. We still believe that. We are still patient. But we remember everything. She sat down. The chamber held its silence for longer than was comfortable. The moderator waited. Nobody moved to speak first. Drac recovered first. He laughed, but it was a short sound, and it came out wrong. Too quick. It had the shape of dismissal, but none of the weight. He looked to his left for the usual support from the Keth section. The Keth representative was looking at the table. Drac looked to his right. The Vorkai junior delegates were still facing forward, watching Nora Hale with expressions that had not fully settled. He said something about humans having long memories and short influence. His aide recorded it. 2 delegates near the back of the hall did not react the way they would have reacted a week ago. Within 40 minutes of the session ending, 3 species quietly sent revised position statements to the moderator's office. None of them named Nora's speech as the reason. All of them adjusted away from the Vorkai stance. The warship halted. It did not retreat. That would come later, but it stopped moving. In the side corridor outside the chamber, Ussel stood with two of his staff and said, "Nothing for a while." He was doing the thing he did when he was processing something he had not expected. His senior aide asked if he was ready to move to the debrief room. He did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the speech, not the content of it. The content had been factual, verifiable, things anyone could have found in the archive. He was thinking about the hands. For minutes and 11 seconds. He had watched them the whole time without realizing. He was doing it. Flat on the table. Not one movement. Not one adjustment. The way a thing is still when stillness is a choice made long before the moment requires it. He had been studying diplomatic behavior for 30 years. He knew what a nervous speaker looked like. He knew what a performing speaker looked like. He knew what someone looked like when they were making something up as they went. He did not know what Nora Hale looked like. He did not have a category for it. "I'm ready," he said finally, and walked toward the debrief room. In the observation gallery, Brielle had watched the whole thing without blinking. She had the timestamp running in the corner of her screen. For minutes 11 seconds. She had noted the silence before Nora stood. She had noted the silence after she sat. She had noted the exact moment Drax's laugh failed to land. She was already typing when her screen flagged an incoming message from Voss. It read, "Send me your full report. Today." Brielle sent it. Then she pulled the archive back open and kept digging. Because Nora's speech had answered nothing she was actually trying to understand. It had only made the question sharper. They remembered everything Nora had said. Everything. Brielle wanted to know how far back that went. The Noon High Council met in a room with no windows. This was traditional. Important decisions were made without the distraction of stars. 12 senior counselors sat in a ring. Brielle stood at the center, which was not traditional. Analysts did not usually present to the full High Council. She had been told that 3 days ago, and she had not slept well since. She presented for 40 minutes. The pulses, the correlation with human silence, the behavioral patterns across 61 years, the speech, the warship stopping. She laid it all out carefully. The way she had been taught to, facts first, interpretation clearly labeled as interpretation, gaps marked honestly as gaps. When she finished, Voss said, "That is the recent history. What did your deeper search find?" Brielle moved to the second part of her presentation. She had gone back 200 years, past formal first contact with humans, into the era when humans were a species on one planet, not yet known to the galaxy, not yet invited to anything. What she had found, once she knew what to look for, was harder to dismiss. Every species that had engaged in armed conflict with humans since first contact had, within 3 generations, lost its position as a military power, not through defeat. In a single war, the pattern was quieter than that. Economic relationships weakened. Trade routes shifted. Alliances that had seemed permanent dissolved over decades. The species remained. Their power did not. Humans did not conquer them, Brielle said. There is no record of a conquest campaign. No formal victory declared. The decline in each case took between 40 and 90 years, and was attributed at the time to internal factors, market changes, political instability. One of the senior counselors asked if that was not simply coincidence. "I thought so," Brielle said, "until I mapped the consistency. 11 cases. Same pattern. Different timescales, different regions, different causes listed in contemporary records. But the outcome is identical every time." She moved to the next finding. Alliances. Every alliance humans had entered had outlasted comparable alliances of the same era. Not because humans were uniquely loyal. The archive actually showed several cases of humans quietly shifting positions on issues over long periods. But they were consistent. They showed up. They remembered what was said. They did not forget. Their longest active alliance, Brielle said, is currently 112 years old. The galactic average for a formal alliance is 31 years. The next longest human alliance is 88 years. Another counselor asked what any of this had to do with the subharmonic pulses. Brielle pulled up the last part of her presentation. This was where the room changed. A Noon historian named Yin had found it in a low-priority archive from 300 years ago. A probe of unknown origin had passed through 7 inhabited systems over the course of about 60 years. The records from that era were incomplete. The Affected civilizations had not yet developed advanced documentation systems. But there was enough. Every civilization the probe had visited had, within 50 years of its passing, experienced a total collapse. Not invasion, not plague, the kind of structural failure that takes root slowly in decisions, in the way power organizes itself, in the small mistakes that compound over time until the weight of them cannot be carried anymore. The probe's design, Brielle said, does not match any cataloged species. She put the schematic on the display. It matches, in 17 structural points, a class of deep observation satellites that humans began deploying in this region 40 years after joining the Council. They registered them as scientific research instruments. The room was quiet. Yen, sitting at the back of the ring as a specialist observer, said softly, "The probe predates first contact by 240 years." Nobody spoke for a moment. Voss said, "You're suggesting humans were here before we knew they were here." "I'm not suggesting anything," Brielle said carefully. "I am marking it as a gap that the data does not close." She did not say what she was actually thinking. She was a behavioral analyst. She worked with facts and labeled her interpretations. But sitting in that room, looking at the schematic, she was thinking about a species that had sat quietly in the back of every room for 61 years, that had never threatened anyone, that had never won a vote by force, that showed up every time and listened and remembered. She was thinking about how long patience had to exist before it stopped being patience and became something else, something that did not have a name in the Noon language. The meeting ended 2 hours later without a formal resolution. The High Council would review. They would commission further study. They would be careful. Brielle walked back to her workspace. On her desk, still open, was the Human Cultural Archive she had found 3 days ago. A public record. Never translated. Never analyzed. She had been reading it in pieces between her research work. It was a collection of stories. Old ones, from before humans had left their planet. Almost every story in it was about waiting. About surviving things that should have ended the person surviving them. About holding on through years of silence and loss and patience until the moment that was coming finally arrived. They all ended the same way. The thing that had waited long enough always won. She closed the archive. She sat for a while. Then she opened a new document and began writing the summary that the High Council had requested. She chose her words very carefully. The alarm never came. That was the strange part afterward. When delegates and staff compared what they remembered, the alarm was always the first thing anyone mentioned, and it was always mentioned as a thing that had come too late. The lights had already changed. The air had already tasted different. And by the time the station's emergency system finally triggered its alert tone, the humans were already moving. The reactor fault hit the station's life support grid at the 14th hour. Not a dramatic explosion. Nothing visible. A failure in the core regulation system that began pulling power from secondary systems in a cascade that, left unchecked, would have stripped breathable atmosphere from 60% of the station within 40 minutes. The central AI went offline 12 seconds after the fault began. That was the real problem. The AI managed the maglock systems on the emergency bay doors. Without it, every escape pod bay on decks 4 through 9 sealed automatically, a fail-safe, designed to prevent pods from launching without navigation clearance, which now became a trap. The corridors filled with noise. The Vorkai delegation moved as a group, loud and fast, toward the priority evacuation route. 2 of Drax's attendants knocked a seat. Staff were down and did not stop. The Nun technical team ran 3 separate rerouting attempts on the power grid and failed all 3 within the first 6 minutes. In the central hub, the intersecting corridor where life support access panels, power, rerouting terminals, and the manual mag lock override systems all sat within 40 meters of each other, it was quiet. 8 humans were already there. Not security staff, not engineers by their official titles. Nora Hale's senior aide. Red had the left side access panel open before the alert tone finished its first cycle. A woman named Deva was at the power rerouting terminal, hands moving through a manual sequence that the Noon team had not attempted because it was not in any standard protocol. 2 others were at the far end of the hub, working on the mag-lock override junction with tools that were not standard issue station equipment. They did not speak. Not one word between them. No commands, no confirmations, no check-ins. They moved like a machine that had already run this sequence before, each person at exactly the right place, doing exactly the right thing, without looking at anyone else for reference. Nora herself was at a small auxiliary panel near the hub center. She had a handheld device connected to the panel's input port. She was not rushing. Her movements were fast, but they were not frantic. There is a difference, and anyone watching could see it. 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the fault began, life support stabilized. The cascade stopped. Power redistributed. 40 seconds after that, the mag locks on the pod bays disengaged, and evacuation resumed in full order. The station's emergency coordinator, a Keth officer named Bruto, reached the central hub 3 minutes after the systems restored. He found the access panels closed, the terminals locked back to standby, and 2 of the humans still in the corridor, checking readings on a handheld sensor. Bruto asked what had happened. Rhett looked up and said the life support rerouting had required manual correction. Bruto asked how they had known to come here before the alert. Rhett said they had heard something change in the ventilation tone. Bruto did not believe this. He was also aware that 40 people were still waiting in a pod bay for final clearance, so he recorded the answer and moved on. Later, in the full incident review, Bruto pulled the hub sensor log. It showed the humans entering the corridor 11 seconds before the emergency alert was triggered. 11 seconds before. The alert was the first official notification of the fault that any non-AI system received. It had gone out the moment the emergency protocol kicked in. The humans had been moving before the protocol kicked in, before any sensor outside the core regulation system had registered anything wrong. Bruto wrote that up and submitted it. He did not know what to do with it except document it. During the evacuation, Drac was escorted to his pod by Rhett. They walked quickly, but the corridor was clear by then. Drac was not a small being, physically or in the space he occupied in any room, but he was quiet in that corridor. He had been quiet since the main systems restored. Just before boarding, he stopped. He turned to Rhett. "How did you know?" he said. It was not a Vorkai diplomatic question. It was a plain question. The kind of person asks when they have dropped the performance and want a real answer. Rhett looked at him. The expression was not unkind. "We always know," he said. He smiled. He helped Drac step aboard. The pod sealed. Drac sat in the pod. He did not speak to his attendants. He stared at the inner wall, plain metal, and thought about a hallway where 8 people had moved in complete silence and put the station back together before anyone else understood it was breaking. He thought about what Nora had said. "We remember everything." He was beginning to understand that this was not a metaphor. In her workspace, Brielle received the incident log feed. She read Bruto's note about the 11-second window. She read it twice. Then she scrolled to the sensor data for the hub corridor and found it, a subharmonic pulse, logged at the moment the fault began in the core regulation system. Same frequency, same 0.3 second duration. At the exact moment the fault began. Not after, not triggered by the alarm. At the exact moment. She sat very still for a long time. Then she added it to the folder labeled Humans and kept reading. A month after the crisis, the council chamber smelled the same as it always had. 100 different worlds. Old walls. The particular weight of a room that has held too many important conversations to feel light about anything. Nora Hale found her seat. She set down her water. She opened her notes. She waited. But the room was different now. It was a small difference. The kind that does not show up in any official record. Nobody had written a resolution that said, "Pay attention to the humans." Nobody had issued a policy change. The behavioral shift had no name and no author and no date of origin that anyone could point to cleanly. But it was there. When Nora walked in, people noticed. Not loudly, not with any ceremony, but eyes moved. Conversations paused for half a second and then resumed. Bodies turned. Slightly, unconsciously, the way bodies turn towards something that the brain has marked as worth tracking. The formal session was a review of the reactor crisis. Incident reports from every species aboard the station during the event were read into the record. The station Engineering team presented its findings. A Keth Safety Commission offered 17 recommendations for AI backup protocol improvements. The Noon Collective proposed a joint emergency response framework. Then came the part about the human delegation's actions in the central hub. The investigation report was read aloud. It was precise and factual and entirely without drama. The human staff had manually rerouted the life support grid using correct procedures. Their response time was exceptional. Their training appeared to be significantly above the standard required of diplomatic personnel. No laws broken. No protocols violated. No further action recommended. The moderator moved to the next item. Drac did not make any comments during the human section of the report. He sat with his hands on the table, both of them flat and still, in a way that was not usual for him. His senior aide noticed. She wrote it in her personal log that evening without being sure why it felt significant. Near the end of the session, the moderator asked if any delegation had a formal statement to add to the record. Nora raised her hand. In the old days, even a month ago, that would have prompted a low murmur somewhere. A small dismissal. The humans were going to say something careful and forgettable. Instead, the chamber went quiet. Every delegate turned to face her. Not quickly, not dramatically, just turned. Ussel, who had once looked at her the way someone looks at furniture, was fully facing her. Before she had even stood up, Drac was already watching. Nora stood. She spoke for 2 minutes. She thanked the investigation team for its thoroughness. She expressed Earth's continued commitment to the Council's emergency cooperation framework. She noted that the joint emergency proposal from the Noon Collective was worth reviewing carefully, and Earth would support moving it to committee. She sat down. It was, by any measure, an ordinary statement. Polite, brief, containing no threat, no hidden meaning, no striking phrase worth recording. But when she finished, the silence that followed lasted almost 30 seconds. Nobody moved to speak. Nobody shuffled notes or checked their screens. The chamber just sat with it, the way a room sits with something that has settled into it and is now simply present. The moderator eventually moved on. The session ended. Delegates filed out. In the observation gallery, Brielle watched them go. She had spent 4 weeks building her full report on the human archive. The High Council had received it. A specialist review committee had been formed. More research was being commissioned. The question of the ancient probe remained open. The question of the pulses remained open. Most of the important questions remained open. But Brielle had stopped expecting those questions to close. Some things were not built to be answered quickly. She watched Nora leave the chamber and thought about everything in the archive. The 200 years of patterns. The ancient probe schematic. The stories about waiting. The silence that produced a physical signal no one had been able to explain. What she had been trying to name, for weeks, was what kind of thing a species was. When it operated this way, the Vorkai were feared for their strength. The Noon Collective was respected for their numbers. Most species had a simple answer to what makes you dangerous. Humans did not fit that structure. They were not especially strong. They were not especially numerous. They had won almost nothing in 61 years of council sessions by any conventional measure. But civilizations that had gone against them had quietly collapsed. Alliances they entered lasted longer than they should. They had been present, really present, in ways no one had looked for, longer than anyone had realized. And when a station started dying, 8 of them had walked into the broken place in perfect silence and put it back together before the alarm finished sounding. It was not strength. It was not numbers. It was something older. The galaxy had recognized it the way a living thing recognizes danger, not in the thinking part, but in the older part, the part that keeps things alive. Brielle gathered her notes and walked down from the observation gallery. Below, in the station's lower corridor, Nora Hale walked back to the human delegation's private chamber. She unlocked the door. She sat at the plain desk near the window. She took out a small journal, paper, handwritten, a habit that confused the station's archivists, and opened it to a fresh page. She wrote 1 sentence. Then she closed the journal and looked out at the stars. The lights in the chamber dimmed automatically as the station moved into its rest cycle. Somewhere in the station's deep infrastructure, a subharmonic pulse resonated 4 0.3 seconds. Then silence.